And I'd ask you to think, I'm going to show you a little film in a minute, just to stimulate some of the thought, but the whole idea of information and what we do with information, I'd ask you to think about, because it can be the sort of millstone, you know, collecting performance management systems, all that sort of stuff, but it is absolutely critical. So if I tell you a story, when I first started about 36 years ago now, started work with young offenders, I had a job in a place called Humberside in the UK, and we used to take groups of kids out, and we had an absolute ball. We used to go canoeing, rock climbing, camping. It was a 7-day-a-week job, and I couldn't wait to get to work. We had an absolute fantastic time with this big old Land Rover. We used to take groups of kids, great time. And then it suddenly dawned on us that we weren't actually making a blind bit of difference. Kids were having a great time, but it was the wrong kids, because there were still kids in court, in police custody, going to court the next day and being locked up. And so systemically, we got it all wrong. So the way we started to approach that was we needed to know who's been arrested by the police, who's in the police cells overnight, who's going to court in the morning. And that's about the use of data and information because you need it, because you want to know it. Not because I'm doing it because government have told me to collect it, or because the inspectors might come round and check on my data. It's got to be, the thing I urge you to think about is, it's got to be useful. It's got to be useful to you. It's got to be something that tells you something about how you're making a difference or not making a difference to the people that you're working with. And all too often we fall into the trap of, well, here's all the data over here, we've got to collect all that, because we've just got to collect it and we've got to report on it. When actually it's got a huge amount to tell us internally and in conversations externally about what's actually going on. So we wouldn't have known half the things that we knew about what was going wrong in Leeds if we'd not had access to data. So I wouldn't have known, apart from the Ofsted report that we had, you know, when we looked at it, we had unallocated cases. We had kids not being seen, we had care plans not being written, we had reviews not being done. Now that's just not sustainable. If we're safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children, those things are pretty basic things. And the only way that you can get on top of simple things like that is by catching the data and just getting into a conversation about, well, let's just try and do those 4 things. Everything's allocated, all kids are seen, they've got a plan, and the plan's reviewed. We'll talk about the quality of those things after, when we're in a reasonably safe position on that basis, just as one example. But if you don't have the data, you can't manage it, you can't deal with it, you can't respond to it. But you need data, stuff that's useful, and that's part of the professional challenge that I think you need to put into the system, that you're collecting things that are useful. It's partly why we also took a conscious decision not to boil the ocean. You know, we still collect more data than's healthy, but we don't bombard everybody with it. The high-level data is the stuff I talked to you about before, the curves, the 3 obsessions, the 12 priorities, the stuff that you might need to know about momentum, direction of travel. But you need to know what's going on in terms of your individual performance, what's actually happening, your practice, actually not performance, your practice. Okay, so I want you to watch this short clip, and I'm going to say a few other things about what's in the clip, and then we're going to have you thinking about curves you might want to turn. Okay, I've got a couple of other things to show you, but I mentioned Mark Friedman to you a couple of times. He's been a great ally and mentor and friend. I've known him a huge amount, too long really. What I do know about Mark is he's got a terrible collection of Hawaiian shirts that he will wear without blushing at any time. He did a piece of work with me when I was director in Hull. And without telling him, we got everybody in the audience to turn up in a horrible Hawaiian shirt. Some of them were quite nice, and he didn't even notice. He didn't even notice. But anyway, here he is talking about his work.
The notion of proving impact, and so many funders these days ask providers, grantees, to prove that they've made an impact on the community. And it's the wrong question. In complex environments, one of the things we've learned from chaos and complexity theory is that cause and effect relationships are not just difficult to know, they're impossible to know. And so in a community level effort, an individual program will never be able to show or prove that it's created an impact at the community level. What programs can be asked to do is they can be asked to demonstrate that they've made a difference in the lives of their customers. And what programs do for their customers then becomes their contribution to community change. So the relationship between programs and community should no longer be thought of as a matter of proof of causality, but rather demonstrating contribution. Now, if we think about the complex set of actions that are typically embodied in a community change process, how do you know if a complex strategy is making a difference at the community level? And here we have not been given very good models to use by the research and evaluation community. Much of the research and evaluation community has been trying to apply the medical model, the control group research model, to complex community change processes, and it just doesn't work. You can't run a community change process for 3 years, see what happens, roll the community back, and run the community without the change process. It just doesn't make sense. So what we need are different models that help us explain whether a community change process is working or not. And I believe that there's actually a way to do this, which I write about in the book. And here's how it works. Imagine, if you will, that you have a curve that you're interested in turning. Whatever that happens to be, can be the juvenile crime rate, the teen pregnancy rate, the rates of air or water quality, it doesn't matter. If you have 3 pieces of evidence, you can begin to demonstrate your contribution to community change. And here are the 3 pieces of evidence. First, that we tried a bunch of stuff that had a credible chance of making a difference. And 2, we saw a timely relationship. To 3, a turn in the curve. If you have these 3 pieces of evidence, you have what I think of as circumstantial evidence that what you did here contributed to, did not cause, but contributed to this turn in the curve. This is pretty much the best you are ever going to do in your career. But it's a powerful, powerful argument. And if you're able to tell this story, you'll have a convincing case with funders and with elected officials and with other stakeholders. If you think back to the stories that we looked at in the course of our morning workshop, Tillamook County, for example, has these 3 elements. They tried a bunch of stuff that had a credible chance of impacting the teen pregnancy rate in their county, and sure enough, we saw a timely relationship to a turn in that curve. In the case of the work of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the same 3 conditions applied. They tried a bunch of stuff that had a chance of making a difference. It wasn't a token effort. And sure enough, they saw a timely relationship in the curve on alcohol-related traffic fatalities in the United States. And the same is true of Boston and all of these other stories. So what I believe is that we need the research and evaluation community and the funding community to give credence to this notion that this 3-part set of evidence is good enough for demonstrating contribution to community change for complex funded initiatives. And I believe that programs and communities will be better off for having their successes acknowledged in this way and not held to the unreasonable standards of medical model research which simply don't apply.
Okay, does that make sense about turning curves? And I think the debate we're going to go into now, the workshop's going to go into now, is what curves would you want to turn? Where could you start? You know, I've said a number of times, start somewhere, pick something where you and a group of like-minded folk that either you're working with or you're connected to can actually start to make a difference. And you'll be amazed at how quickly that works. So if I remember the instructions I got from Tim, when I showed you earlier on the looked after children, this is where we were, this is where we were heading, this is where we've gone, and we've turned that curve. And you may have heard Graham, and I think I mentioned it as well, this notion of curves within curves. So if you turn one, other things start to happen, okay? So one of the things we had in Leeds was when we started, it was down in the dumps, it was not seen to be a good place to work, so we were spending a huge amount on agency social workers. So paying double the amount we would pay an ordinary social worker. Newly qualified social workers were coming to Leeds, spending 6 months with us, and then going off somewhere else where they got more money, and it was an easier life, to put it bluntly. Leeds was not seen, it failed its Ofsted, it was on government intervention. Why would I want to go and work there? And it's tough, it's a big place. Why would I do that? At the end of if you follow the curve in terms of looked after children, which matches the timescale of the story I've shared with you today, this is where we were on agency spend in children's services. That's where we were heading, not sustainable. That's where we've gone. And that's saved us £14 million, again, by having a stable, well-motivated workforce. A curve within a curve. If you look at external residential placements, so think about how that works. Overwhelmed with referrals come in, they turn into child protection plans. Child protection plans increase the likelihood that they're going to come looked after children. The looked after children placements become full, you haven't got enough foster carers, you haven't got enough residential placements. You pay for an expensive bed outside of the authority. Not because that resource is the one that best meets the needs of that young person, because that's where the bed is, and you pay for the bed, okay? So that's where we were, that's where we were heading, that's where we've gone. 134 fewer children, young people in expensive external residential placements, about £20 million annual saving. And like Mark says, when you've got these graphs and these curves that can demonstrate that change in pattern, then you've got a really significant argument when you're going into your budget conversations, when you're going into any of the funding arrangements, as well as those conversations about improved practice and quality of life conditions that we've talked about today. Third one, last one, children subject to a child protection plan, so that if your referral rate at the front door, if you're bombarded at the front door, it's more likely. The easy option is you put kids on a child protection plan because it's just, you've ticked the boxes, you've made a safe response. Those numbers will continue to increase. That's where we were. That's where we were heading. That's where we've gone. And we're down per 10,000 fewer, 120 per 10,000 fewer children on a child protection plan. So just think about that idea of curves within curves as we go into the next set of conversations. And the framework for all this is what I referred to at the beginning, what we call outcome-based accountability, what you here will call or understand to be results-based accountability. And there's a number of people in the room that are engaged in that process already. There's a number of people across South Australia, because I know the work that Mark's done here, that are engaged in that process already. I would urge you to grab hold of that. And if you've not heard about it or you've not engaged with it, to engage with it. It's not embedded in the child welfare services or the child welfare world here in South Australia as much as it is in other parts of South Australia or other parts of public services. And there is work going on to promote that, because I think it gives you a disciplined way of thinking about how much did we do, how well did we do it, have we made a blind bit of difference, and what are the curves that we want to turn. And it'll help you mobilise your arguments and your evidence to bring about the change that I sense you want to bring about. Okay, so I'll stop there, I think. Is that okay?
To clarify the question, so what are the curves we want to change?
Yeah, I think just the what?
I
don't know where the slide went, but I'll find it in a minute. I would have a conversation about the notion of turning curves, about how you use data to turn curves, and then just pick some examples on your table. Where would you start? What would the curve be? What's the sort of data you would need? Who are the people that can come together to help you with that? And what are you likely to be able to commit to do? Okay? Doesn't need anybody to come and give you permission. But where would you start? What would you go with? What's the bit that you worry about the most that you might want to change in your particular world? And this is stuff where you want to do this. You'd like to see that change in pattern. And therefore you need accurate information or good enough information to make a start in terms of that. Okay? Go.
Nigel, in a minute, we'll run through some of the questions and answers. Is there anyone from the floor that would like to talk about, so even if it wasn't, an idea and/or something that you found most challenging about discussing that particular topic of capturing and using data? Anyone like to make an observation? Thank you. I know, because I said at the table at the back, I've got to invite their comments, so thank you.
A lot of our conversation was about the data, but the story behind the data. So we talked about the school attendance data and the every minute counts kind of concepts, and about how many minutes you miss a day equates to how many years over the course of your schooling lifetime. But understanding why children aren't coming on time, why they're coming at lunchtime so they can go to OSH in the afternoon. So having the data is one piece of the information, but delving deeper into what's happening in that space is a bit more complicated.
Yes. So again, that was Nigel's comment, wasn't it, about which data to collect and why. So thank you. Other comments or questions before? It looks like Nigel is nearly ready to go. Okay, all right. So over to you. But just before you do that, Nigel, just so that Nigel's going to, as I said, respond to the questions now, and then we'll make some, we'll open up again for any questions from the floor about anything that Nigel has covered today. Then Nigel will make some closing remarks and show us one last video to wrap things up together. And then I'll pass back to Sandra Robinson from Together SA and to Graham Brown from Junction Australia to then look at where to from here. And then we've got some lovely fresh fruit and nibbles for people at about 4:15. We'll finish and hope that you've got about a quarter of an hour or so to continue just doing some networking out over a last cup of coffee to send you home. So thanks, Nigel.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for those questions. So, whole range of questions here on the table. There's a massive bunch that have a theme about sharing data. How did you get people to agree to share the data? And I suppose, let me answer that one, or that big group of questions. There was a significant number around that. And I know there's a particular context here as well, which I hopefully will be addressed as things move forward. But fundamentally, when I talked about having the vision, having the plan agreed, having that top table where conversations take place about children. So if you look at the plan and you've got versions on your table, or you've got access to them, that's where we got the agreement to share the data, because everybody signed up to this plan. Now, and then you need the data that goes behind it. You need the evidence that goes behind it. The point that was just made by a colleague earlier on is absolutely critical. Data is just data. Indicators are indicators. The story behind them is absolutely the key thing. They lead you in the direction of, an indicator is what it says. An indicator tells you something about something. It doesn't tell you whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because the context is different. Okay, so the story behind, setting a baseline, understanding the story behind a baseline, and then understanding whether you want to turn the curve up or down, or whether you're quite happy for it to carry on in a straight line is critical. You need the story behind the data, but the data leads you to that particular story. You may also find there's things that you want to do where you haven't got any data. You don't collect it. But it doesn't mean don't do it. Just part of the activities to then think about how are we going to measure that? How are we going to catch that? Our most challenging bit was, how do we measure voice and influence? Now, you can do it on individual case basis and individual stories, but how do you start to put a scorecard together? How do you start to put something together when you're looking at the voice and influence of 180,000 children and young people? And we've probably still not cracked that completely, but we're having a go and we're trying things and we're trying different ways and ideas that we think are good enough to give us a sense of what's going on, and we check those out with children and young people themselves. So nothing's ever perfect, I suppose is what I'm saying. Don't wait until you've got the perfect thing or the perfect system. Start with your best end, that Mark said on his film. You know, a bunch of stuff that all the evidence suggests has got a reasonable chance of making a difference. And then try that. And then just find out a way of measuring whether or not that's making a difference. Okay, so there's a big bunch of those questions over there. How do we cope with the incompatibility of data sets? So that bit, not only do boundaries have to be different so that nobody can work together, you always have to buy a different computer system to everybody else, so you can't possibly share the data. You never really get over that. And that's why I think I said right at the very beginning in Leeds, we like a good list. And we compare lists against lists. If it's really troublesome, it doesn't have to be an electronic exchange of data. If you're having the conversations about the most vulnerable kids, you're agreeing those things. If it comes down to it, just share a list. Just start sharing information and data about what do you know about what it's like to be a child or young person growing up in this particular area. Police have a wealth of information, health have a wealth of information, education have a wealth of information, the social care agencies have a wealth of information, third sector have a wealth of information. When you get into those conversations about the top 100, who are the children or the families we're most worried about, the next logical thing is, well, why are we worried? Who knows what about them? What's going on? And have that conversation. So systems are systems, and there's a huge industry out there of people selling systems and data systems, and there's a huge history, certainly in the UK, of big investment in IT systems that just haven't worked on a national scale. So big challenge for you. So don't get preoccupied with that. It'll just give you a headache. Was there a focus on the early years in Leeds to turn the curve earlier? Yes, and that's predicated on what I said in the presentation, as early in the life of the child as possible, and then as early in the life of the problem as possible as children grow up. And we've got a strategy which you can have access to on the website, the Best Start strategy. It's jointly owned by the Health and Wellbeing Board that we've got, and in partnership with Health, jointly funded as well. And it runs out of the 52 children's centres across the city. And that's predicated on the clear evidence that the first 2 years of a child's life is significant. And as earlier in the life of the child as possible, as early in the life of the problem as possible. And I'd urge you to think about that as well. People talking here, there's one question about, did you concentrate on positive measures as well as some of the negative stuff and curves just turning downwards? All the curves might, actually thinking about it, they probably all did go down, but they can go the other way as well, depending on what you measure and which direction you want the curve to turn in. And sometimes they go in the wrong way, but for the right reasons. So when we had a big push on family violence, because when we looked at what was coming through the front door in terms of referrals, as an example, and I gave you that the 90% of the business is a massive cocktail of those complicated factors, which included domestic violence or family violence. When we put a coordinated effort about that, the curve went up, went in the wrong direction. Now, when you look at the story behind the baseline, that's because there was an increased confidence in notifications, in referrals, in people putting their hand up and saying, I want to talk about this. And so that's a good thing. Some of our looked after figures have started to do that. Having done the big curve, they've started to bounce along the bottom. They're bouncing along the bottom because we have taken a clear decision as a child-friendly city to respond to the humanitarian crisis in terms of refugees. So we've got more children becoming looked after on that basis. Story behind the baseline, we're quite happy with it doing that because that's what it needs to do in response to that particular set of issues. So the point that was made, again, go back to it, the story behind the baseline, behind the figures, really important. And we had there's a couple of others, different sets of questions there, but there was one, what is the most powerful piece of data that you've got? Oh, that's a good question, because I don't know whether I know. And I suppose the one that gave me the most pleasure, I suppose, was when we started, I think I referred to this earlier on, when I asked the question, how many care leavers have we got? Nobody knew. We didn't know how many care leavers. So never mind, don't bother asking the question, well, where are they? Because we don't know. But when we reached the point where we did know, and then we knew where they were and how connected they were, then that just is a good feeling, that you can actually get a sense that you've got, because care leavers, think about it, that's our children, corporate responsibility. It's like your own children growing up and you're not knowing where they are. So that was a big piece of information. But then you get the bounce back on that, because when we go further in the conversations, as I said earlier, they then start to tell you a set of really important bits of information about loneliness and lack of connectivity. So I'm sat there thinking, that's it, we know where they are, we know what's going on, they're well connected, not quite sorted, but we're in a reasonably good place. And then the kids would say, yeah, all that's true, but there's this. And then you start again, and you go through the process that way. But that's a great question. And I suppose different bits of data will be the most powerful, the most important at different times, depending on what context you find yourself in, and what conversations you're in, what funding arguments you're in, what political arguments you're in. You know, it'll move around in different ways. So, is that okay? There's a few others. I mean, I think we're going to undertake to try and get some sense of a response to all the questions that have been asked anyway, if I've not covered them now. Okay, am I back on?
You come back up.
I'll come back up.
So I can hear it.
We're nearly there, gang. Okay, stick with us. Let me just say a couple of things by close, and I'm going to show another film again in a moment. And I've had a couple of comments where people have asked me, did we script the kids on the film about the Ofsted inspection? Well, we didn't, but Ofsted did. Because what they were, I should have made it clear when I showed you the film, but what the young people were doing was they were reading out sections of the Ofsted inspection report that we got. So rather than us just going around the city telling people, oh look, we got an inspection report and we're really pleased with it, we had a conversation with a bunch of young people who said they'd quite like to make a film with us about it. And so they are reading out sections of the report, the inspector's report. So they're speaking in Ofsted language on that basis. Okay, let me just say a couple of things, and I want to show you another film. And I suppose the first thing I want to say is I've mentioned outcomes quite a lot, and if you look at the vision of a child-friendly city, those 5 outcomes, if I had to pick one thing, we get a lot of attention onto the 3 obsessions, which help mobilise things, but the 5 outcomes were the starting point, really. Brokering a conversation across the city as to what were the conditions of well-being that we wanted for all children and young people. Got us going. So yes, the ambition around a child-friendly city, but it was actually nailing the outcomes that we wanted for children and then sticking with them. And the reason for that is because it changes so many of the conversations, and some of the challenges that you've put forward, some of the questions you've put forward, I think would disappear if you had an agreed set of outcomes across South Australia for children and young people, would be my personal view. And I've got a list here again from a colleague of mine, Mike Pinnock, who gave, when we were talking about the importance of outcomes, just think about this list. Outcomes, remember when I was saying outcome, conditions of well-being that you want for individuals or groups of people. Outcomes bring clarity and consistency of purpose. Outcomes describe the difference we want to make. Outcomes demand a common language and common meaning. You see how these ideas start to shape some of the things that you've been throwing back in terms of questions or challenges that you're experiencing. Outcome-orientated ideas work best in outcome-orientated cultures. So if you get a set of outcomes, it forces you to think again about the culture of the organisation that you're working in, because it's got to respond to an outcome focus. Only partnerships can improve outcomes. Can't be done on your own. It has to work in partnership. Outcomes provide a starting place for understanding progress. So once you've got your outcome, you set your baseline, you look at the story behind that baseline, then you can start to measure how you're making a blind bit of difference moving forward. Outcome data can tell powerful stories. And stories are really powerful ways of persuading others to come alongside with what you're trying to do. Outcomes are not commodities. So they're not things. One of the phrases that we hate in Leeds is people talk, whether I should say this, but when people tend to talk about delivering things. We're going to deliver good outcomes. Well, you don't deliver good outcomes. You deliver pizza. You don't deliver outcomes. Outcomes are human conditions of well-being. They're not things that are neatly parcelled up and delivered to the doorstep. They're complicated things. They're not commodities. Outcomes hold our plans together. That plan that I've seen, the plan on a page, is held together by the 5 outcomes. And our favourite is outcomes help keep us sane. Help keep us sane. It's a mad, crazy world out there. The minister started by saying about the level of complexity in the work that you do day in, day out. It is insanely complicated and can start to get you down if you let it. But having something as clear as a set of outcomes that remind you when the going gets tough of why you're coming to work and why you're doing what you do can make a significant difference. And that's why I'd urge you to think about that moving forward. So that's why outcomes matter. This is why right at the very beginning I talked about conversations and relationships and connections being really important. Again, we got to a point, you've noticed I quite like films, and I often disappear into a virtual shed and come out and annoy the staff with another film, because films sometimes have a different way of getting ideas across that's hard with words or the written word, and it just takes you into a different space, thinking space. So this, we gave a camera and a film crew to a bunch of young people just before I left my job in Hull to move to Leeds. And we had some time with the film crew left, and we gave them a bunch of young people, and they went off into Hull to make a film. And this is their film, and it's called Flowers. And think about connections, relationships.
It's just to put a smile on your face.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Film about connections and relationships and hardly any speaking, so it just makes you think, doesn't it? So I'd ask you to think about that. And the final thing, going right back to where we started, in terms of Victoria's story, I mentioned to you about Victoria spending those 2 weeks in the hospital, the second visit to the hospital. If you go back to the first visit, the first hospital admission, which I think I said to you at the time was when she was allegedly suffering from scabies. Now, actually, the agencies responded reasonably well there. She came into the hospital, the agencies responded, phone calls were made, she was detained in the hospital, the consultant was called, the police were called, social workers were called. Everybody started to focus in on what was happening. What happened to Victoria? How was this child? What was actually going on? But fundamentally, nobody ever spoke to Victoria properly, and nobody ever asked a very simple question. Remember I said to you earlier on about childcare or context? Nobody asked a very simple question. There was a lot of activity about her in the hospital, but nobody ever asked the question, so how did she get here? How did she get here? How did she arrive in the hospital? And if I tell you that Victoria arrived in that hospital on that day in the arms of an unregistered childminder, then what does that tell you? And what does it take if you're an unregistered childminder to be so worried about the welfare of somebody else's child that you'll pick them up and you'll take them to hospital? And just think what would have happened if somebody had gone and asked the childminder, the unregistered childminder, tell us your story, tell us about Victoria. What would have happened in terms of outcomes for Victoria as a consequence to that? All the evidence would suggest they would have been significantly different if the social workers, the health professionals and everybody else had that information at their disposal. That's why it's so important to think beyond just what you're looking at in the immediacy of the case that you're dealing with. And look at, it's another way of explaining that story behind the baseline. What's the story we're dealing with here? And am I thinking wide enough about child, carer and context? And that's why outcomes matter. That's why what you're doing matters, and that's why I wish you every success for the future. Thanks for listening.
I was just saying to Nigel to stay up here because there might be some last burning questions. Has anyone got anything that they would like to ask? Nigel, this I know you're probably really tired, but this is just a wonderful opportunity to have Nigel here. If you think you're tired, he's travelled from England. He's got a little bit of jet lag still. He's waiting for his red wine, which is coming. I know, Graham, isn't it?
I was told a lie.
He's told a lie. No, he's not told. Any questions from anyone? Yes, at the back. Thank you.
You've been going for about 6 years now, is that right?
That's right.
How do you feel that you're going to keep the momentum up for the next 30 years, say, so that the next generation of children are not left out? Because I know that from living in this particular area, which we're one of the low socioeconomic areas of the country, that there's a lot of short-term programs come here all the time and they just disappear. So how do you know that you're going to keep this going for the next generation?
No, it's a good question, and it's in a way when we look back at it, and we didn't realise this at the time, but until it started to get pointed out to us by partners and others, that we hadn't changed the plan for 6 years, and that how unusual that was for local government, because normally 18 months if you're lucky, 2 years tops, and it's time for the next big thing that comes in. So holding your nerve has been a key part of the strategy. And with that comes political buy-in and a political commitment and a cross-party political commitment to hold the nerve. So, and the other bit that gives me confidence is when the inspectors did come back, and there was a lot of them, as I said to you earlier, and they're here a long time, the best bit of feedback we got, or personally for me, was none of it was built on sand. So none of it was sort of here today, gone tomorrow. The other thing is, succession planning. We've got a group of, followers, lone nuts and all sorts dancing their way down the corridors in Leeds who are committed, who've made conscious career-defining decisions because they want to work in Leeds, they want to work in that way. We've got a fully staffed social work workforce now, which we never had. People are waiting for vacancies. We're not struggling in terms of recruitment. Give you another curve within a curve. When we started, we had an agency-populated social work workforce, but we also had a very young, inexperienced workforce as well, newly out of college, newly qualified. So the 2 years post-qualifying experience was way below 50%. It's now way over 85%. So by investing in the workforce, by them, now they're part of the succession plan as well, because they're not going anywhere either. They've committed themselves on that basis. It is a risk. It is a risk, but I think there's enough things in play, and there's enough grounding of those things now after the 6 years. And to be fair, the political investment that was put in, and if you want to call it a gamble, if you want to call it backing, a particular way of working, investing some money in it. We invested £1 million in family group decision making. It paid back £4 million as a consequence of some of the curves that you saw turning, so they got paid back that way. Where we are now as a local authority, in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of other local authorities, has paid back hugely to the political commitment that they gave to going with the vision. And there's enough people out there now who will be very grumpy if it all disappears. Does that make sense? Thank you.
And over here, thank you. Just 1 second for the
Quality
wait for the
of IT systems.
yes.
Given that it seems over 6 years you've developed something that works, how transferable is the platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was up on one of the questions I didn't get around to answering. So it's a thing, it's a system, and it's not perfect, and it still causes us problems. But we've the point I made earlier on, the first system we had was just hopeless, and it just didn't really work. You couldn't get, social workers would come in the morning. The story used to go: you come in the morning, switch the machine on, go off, make a cup of tea, do a bit of shopping, come back, wait for it to warm up, and then eventually you might get around to being able to do something on it. So it was just not fit for purpose, let alone get the sort of intelligent interrogation of the system and the data that was in there. It was a bit of a Heath Robinson thing. When Leeds were very inward looking, we'll build our own, we won't buy one, we'll make our own. And we went through a period when we did invest in a new one. None of them were that good, if I'm honest. There's a limited range of products that are out there. So we picked sort of best fit, and one where the supplier was willing to be flexible and work with us to build it around that plan. And build it around, the brief was to try and build it around a day in the life of a social worker. The performance indicator that I gave the software company was, you've got to make social workers happy. They've got to love the system, enjoy using it, which is, they didn't take to very kindly, but that was the, and to be fair, there's the people still a bit grumpy, but actually it does help them safeguard and promote the welfare of children now. Whereas before, it got in the way of helping them safeguard and promote the welfare of children. It was a chore. I won't say it's a pleasure now, but it's better than it, significantly better than it was. So it's transferable in the sense you can go and buy it. You can buy it from the same, but you'd have to do that work when you put it in. And I think what a lot of people end up doing is they buy the product and get sold the line that says it will do everything for everybody, and then you find that it doesn't. So having a clear plan, having a clear expectation of what you want it to do, and it's to help you safeguard and promote the welfare of children, takes you in that direction. But there was probably 2 or 3 we could have bought, but they weren't. There's none that are. It's a big deficit. It's a big deficit. There's none that are off the shelf products in that way. So you could buy it, but you'd need to do the work.
In a very broad sense, what has listening to the voices of children done for Leeds, and where is Leeds going if you keep listening?
It's transformational, and add into that children, young people and families as well, and moving from the doing to box into the doing with box has been absolutely transformational, and it's more about that change in mindset and that culture change that has transformed the way we do our business. And what it's found is, and we went through the usual sort of discussions with staff about, you can't give people too much of a voice, and you can't ask too many, we've got a professional responsibility to make. And that, they didn't mean that in a paternalistic sort of way of we know best, but there was an element of the law's the law and we've got to do this. But when we got into, well, what would it be like? What would it feel like? And how would it work? And we got into some of those conversations with families and children, and some of those stories started to emerge. What people were finding was they'd been working with just a fraction of the potential for change or assistance or help that was there. But because of the way the interaction or the relationship between the state and the citizen was fixed down a doing 2 or doing 4 track, with the best will in the world, you were missing a whole raft of things, because you weren't engaging in a conversation about, tell me about your family, tell me about the extended family, no, tell me a bit more, tell me about this, tell me about that, what do you think? So it's just absolutely transformational. Where's it going to take us is, and I mean, the other thing I suppose I would say is, be ready to hear things you don't want to hear. Be ready to be told stuff that you think's, that's quite, because people are not shy in coming forward and telling you about things, and they want that they want you to know about. Where next with it is, it can go as far as it can go, really. I mean, we've got the takeover stuff, we've got the children's mayor, we've got the youth parliament, various bits of representation. We're working with the National Children's Commissioner on enhancing certain things around voice and influence. The stuff with families, I think, is going to take us. That's the deal breaker. That's the one that's going to take us to the next level. We'll be the only authority in the country, I think, if things continue to go to plan, where it will become an entitlement to families. This is what will happen. It won't be a project you refer to. It won't be an option that we might think about. This is how we will respond. And within that, there will be a set of rights and responsibilities that we'll be talking, which is what the with box is all about: high support, high challenge. That's the bit that's going to be the next push. That make sense? Thank you. Hi, there's another one.
Yes.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the interface with the non-government sector, because we've talked very much about the state base, and a lot of our services are funded and supported by NGOs.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. They've been absolutely massive partners, and I suppose the language I try and use, and I've probably not used it, I've not stuck to the discipline of it, is representatives of the state. So in a way, the third sector, as we would call it in the UK, is still part of that. It's public money and public expenditure. They've been a critical part, and a great friend and a great ally, and a huge partner. We've got an organisation called Young Lives Leads that tries to coordinate the whole third sector body, which, as you know, can be quite a challenge because of the nature and size and difference in nature and size of those things. They were absolutely 100% behind the creation of and the engagement with the plan, and the feedback from them is we became easier to do business with once we had the plan on a page, because the conversations were clearer. Didn't mean they weren't still tough, didn't mean we still didn't get into some difficult conversations about funding, but we were easier to do business with, and the conversations were much more honest about how much did we do, how well did we do it, is anybody any better off, and how it fits to that plan. And some of the third sector have changed how they work. They got access to the training on outcome-based accountability, the training on restorative practices, the training on voice and influence. They're engaged in all the, just an open invitation to, they're in all the cluster setups around the 25 they're a key partner, really. And I know I'm on film now. I'm not just saying that. They'd happily be here, actually, but they would want to talk to you about the difference between what it was like before and what it's like now. Still challenges, but good, strong partnership. Does that make sense? Thank you. Graham, can't possibly have a question. All those bloody emails you sent me, you can't possibly have a question.
It's going to be a long glass of wine, Nigel. Can you talk to us more about those clusters, the community clusters that you talked about? Because I think there's probably people here saying, well, what if this was a cluster? What would a cluster be doing?
So a cluster is, when I first arrived in Leeds, clusters existed, sort of, okay? And I'll explain what I mean by sort of. Back in the day in the legislation in the UK, there was an opportunity for schools to access something called extended schools money. So they got extra money for doing extra work, basically, put it crudely. And some of the schools, some of the heads worked out that if they joined together with some of the schools locally, the money went a bit further. So extended services, I think it was called. And so they already existed. And but it was what's the language? A mixed ability class across the 25. But they were there, so it was a gift. It was a gift, and that's the language I used at the time. This is a bit of a gift in terms of trying to understand the geography of Leeds. Let's not get rid of them. And there was an ownership and a buy-in from schools who we wanted to be key partners anyway. Some of them had got more multi-agency aspects to them, but others hadn't. They were just schools on their own talking. So what we did was, well, let's take the geography, and they're all a different side. They're all no two are the same. No two are the same, but they work, and it covers the entire city. And we took the best of what we thought, and we looked at the model, we had the top table, and we just made sure, right, every cluster, you're all going to have one of them, one of them, one of them, and one of them. And by that, I mean, you're all going to have the same partners around the table. You're all going to have, there'll be a chair. We'll put in some staff from the local authority because we dismantled the centralised system and pushed it out to local areas. So they all got a targeted services leader. They were all going to get access to it. So there were some givens about what will help be the lifeblood of a cluster to keep it ticking over. And the deal was, whatever you do, whatever you talk about, you can have all the data about how many kids live in your cluster, how healthy they are, how safe they are, how well they're doing at school, against the outcomes, against the priorities, against the 3 obsessions. The deal is you talk about those things. You talk about the 3 obsessions, you talk about the 12 priorities, you talk about the 5 outcomes, and your contribution to that, using Mark's language, your contribution to turning the curves on those. And then you can talk about what the hell you like. You can do what you want because it will be different in each cluster and there'll be different additional priorities. In certain clusters in the outer, the more wealthier areas of Leeds, minimal the looked after numbers, minimal, but might have significant challenges around childhood obesity or something else might be the issue, social, emotional, mental health issues or something. It doesn't matter. But the deal is you will still go through that framework. So multi-agency, geographical identity, top sliced money from schools themselves, because in a way they were their idea originally and we've just built on them. Local authority contributes that way around. Now got political representation, so there's an elected member, elected representative on each of the clusters. I could tell you more, but they're a wonderful thing.
Okay, any one last question? Yes, the man at the back.
What didn't work? Oh, crikey, we've probably got a shed load of bonkers ideas that never got off the ground. Some of the early iterations of trying to do stuff that was top down, we very soon got our fingers burnt on that and worked out that that's not the way it was going to work, and we needed to be more restorative and stick to our principles a little bit more, perhaps not be as impatient as we were at the beginning about expecting instant results, holding our nerve when stuff went wrong was tough because the temptation is to knee-jerk back into old behaviours, and you have to go and lock yourself in the shed and shout and swear a lot for a bit and then come out and be calm. Impatience with things like that. We've not had that many, and I suppose we didn't quite expect some of the professional challenge back to that it was going to be such a significant professional challenge to people, because in my naive world, what we were trying to create was what people came into the job in the first place to do. But actually people have grown up so closely aligned to that risk-averse, this is what we do, doing things to families, doing things for families. They were very nervous about letting go of that and felt they were going to be, when actually our argument was if you let go of that, you're going to be in a safer position because you're going to be working with all this other resource around there. And you're not just a lonely social worker holding all the risk. Whereas if you're in the old orthodoxy, you're there holding all the risk. But some people didn't like that, didn't get that. We got a lot of challenge. Huge support from the unions, interestingly enough. They got it early on and were very, very helpful and very supportive. So there's probably a lot of things like that. It's a good question. It's a good question. Is that okay? Thank you.
Yeah, any closing remarks that you'd like to make?
No, just, genuinely, I'm not here to say just copy leads and everything will be fine, but take what makes sense, use some of the learning. The other thing we did, which you might want to think about, is Leeds, I hinted at it earlier, it was very insular, inward looking. We're Leeds, we're a big northern city, we can sort this out ourselves. Massive shock when they were told, no, you haven't actually. And it's pretty dangerous practice, and there were some horrible cases attached to that as well. But what we did consciously was then open it up. So we've got literally a small army of crazy academics. And where I use the word crazy advisedly, because they're not your traditional ivory tower sort of theoretical academics. They're practice-orientated people pushing the boundaries on some of this stuff. And that we've invited them in, and they've been working with us on and helping us explore some of these new ideas and different ways of working from around the world. And what they get is a free research base to do their work. The power that brought with it in terms of, and I'll use social workers again as an example, but social workers having the time to sit down with some of their social work heroes and talk about social work and what good social work looked like, and building in time for reflective practice and reflective supervision, which was sadly lacking earlier on, getting down to manageable caseloads. But just that intellectual curiosity that allowed us to get people into a different space and gives people another reason to come to work in the morning was of huge benefit. And we've learned so much from from colleagues in New Zealand, from in Australia, from Nova Scotia, from Europe, other renowned academics in the education world, the health world, etc., etc. And we're always on the lookout, because you never stop learning. If you want to be what we're trying to create was a learning organisation. So I think that's a message. Last one, wonderful quote somebody once said to me, because a lot of people say to us when they look at the plan and they say, oh, well, that's just common sense, isn't it? That's just common sense. And it's true, it's not rocket science, but somebody once said, the problem with common sense is it's not that common. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Nigel.